Welcome to the Link Yacht Podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Glenn Franklin. Glenn worked for many years at the Washington Post. He won a Pulitzer Prize and has taught journalism at Stanford University and University of Texas. He's also a New York Times bestseller author, and today we will speak about his latest book, Shooting Midnight Cowboy: Art, Sex, Loneliness, Liberation, and the Making of a Dark Classic. Glenn, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me, Alan.
So I see from the description that you have been into journalism for a long time. Has it been all your life? Is that what you study?
All my professional life, and no, I did not study it at all. This is, I grew up in the era when, there were journalism schools, but journalism was considered a craft that one sort of fell into in some ways, and I fell into it. I always wanted to be a writer. I realized pretty quickly after university that I wasn't going to be a writer unless I got paid. And this is the early 1970s. It's the time of Watergate. It was obvious to me, putting the pieces together, that journalism, that newspapers at the time did pay you to write. And I fell into it. I found it worked very well for me for a lot of reasons and stayed with it for about 33 years or so.
And how does one fall into journalism at that time in history?
Well, one falls into it by finding a place where they have some newspapers that are not overloaded with applicants. In my case, my girlfriend, who I've now been living with for about 50 years, my wife, got accepted in a teaching program in Richmond, Virginia. And so we moved there. We were living actually in San Francisco, which was an impossible place to get a journalism job because there were so many young people walking the streets like me with college degrees, but no real skills.
Right.
But in Richmond, Virginia, it was a little easier. I got a job on a very small weekly newspaper south of Richmond. I made $1.65 an hour. But I got paid, and I quickly found that it wasn't just the writing, but being a journalist involving learning a community, being part of a community, and yet having one foot outside the community, being a critical thinker, if you will, that really fit my personality, my needs and my sensibility. And so it took a long time to get good at it. But eventually I managed to make my way to the Washington Post, which at that point was, and still is, one of the great newspapers in the world. And that really helped me enormously. And I had a wonderful career in newspapers. Finally left in 2006 when I got a nice buyout from the Washington Post. And as you mentioned earlier, went off to teach journalism at Stanford University and the University of Texas. But I have had a very fortunate career, Elaine. That's all I can say.
Okay, so you were practicing journalism at a time period where journalism could be considered a career. But nowadays, journalism, from my point of view, is what kind of clickbait can I create for my, boss or this content manufacturing business. So from your perspective, what's the future of journalism? Is it just going to be clickbait, or would it come back to a more balanced content producing job?
Look, it's always been about clickbait, or the predecessors of clickbait, the gossip columnists, the tabloids, the yellow journalism, as we called it in America. That's always been a part of it. But I agree with you that the last few years, the last couple of decades, during the digital media revolution, that things have gotten much more difficult, that having a career like I had, where you go to one great news organization and you stay there, I was at the Washington Post for 27 years, that's less likely to happen. And we're still sort of sorting out the future of journalism and the economic future of journalism. Nonetheless, you can't have a democracy without information. Even during these difficult times, places like the Washington Post and the New York Times and National Public Radio, and I'm sure in Canada, many places you could name, have carried on a great tradition. I think our democracy is in great danger in the United States right now, and it would be in much worse danger without those media institutions. So I don't know the future. I think it's up in the air. I do know from teaching university, students in university over the last, during an 8-year period, that they're very intelligent, that they're very dedicated. They're no less principled than I was starting out, and they're much more knowledgeable. And I only can hope that a new generation can reinvent news organizations and make sure that, yes, there'll always be clickbait, but that there will also be the important information we need to run a democracy to make intelligent decisions. That's my hope.
I've been hearing about this trend of experienced journalists creating a newsletter and getting people to contribute to the newsletter. Now, I don't know how much of a trend that is. I have heard from time to time, but I don't know how popular that is. And do you see that as a viable opportunity for journalists who want to write this long form kind of journalism?
Yeah, there's so many things out there right now. What we call the barriers to publication are very low these days. You don't need millions and millions of dollars to go online and start something up. How you find readers, what kind of journalism you're doing, how you attract audiences, because clickbait doesn't really work for small journalists, because everybody else is doing it. You've got to find something that appeals to an audience. But nonetheless, as I say, the barriers to entry, as we call it, are very low. Here we are on your podcast. People are doing all kinds of interesting things. The question is how they attract readers. So yes, that's one of many, many what I would call green shoots out there of interesting journalism. Places like the Texas Tribune and down in Austin have had a very successful business model, being a nonprofit and covering specifically government and those kinds of issues. There are many ways in, many ways out, but the problem is that nobody knows exactly what the future is going to be. New technology is coming along, every year, every day. And so we tried to teach our students how to be flexible, how to be smart, how not to be afraid of technology, how to use technology. But we also tried to teach them critical thinking, the importance of getting under the surface of stories, who were sources, of being transparent about your work, all the things that date back, the values of journalism that date back long before my career began.
Right. Okay, one more question I got two questions in regard to journalism. One of them is, I follow the stock market and I'm always looking at the stocks going up and down. And I have noticed that some of the articles written nowadays when I'm following the stock markets are written not by regular people like you and me, but by artificial intelligence. Let's say Apple declares their revenue. So here comes this artificial intelligence robot, I may say, and they just put all the facts. Apple declared, revenue of X, dividends of X, and, maybe a quote from what the CEO said, and it's all written by a computer. They have just kicked their journalists to the side. We say, we don't need you anymore. We don't want to pay your salary or your vacation days. So is artificial intelligence going to take at least part? It's already taking part of the journalist job, no?
Yeah, the basic information, the facts, you can get in so many sources. You need to know who those sources are, though, because you can also get something that aren't the facts, that are very twisted and that are used. So critical thinking about all this is more important than ever, not just by the journalists themselves, but by the consumers. I think it's really important, what we call media literacy, training so that people can take courses, for example, in their undergraduate, in university, in thinking about what journalism is, how you tell a real journalism story from a fake one. Sure, there'll be more automation, there'll be all kinds of things, but the need for good, solid information that's vetted by smart people you know, I have to think that that's a commodity you can also sell. I mean, the New York Times has doubled, tripled its, its readership over the last couple of years, thanks to digital media and the ability to go online. The Washington Post is reaching out globally. We used to be a local newspaper, the Washington Post, so mostly focused on Washington and its area, but also on the government because it happened to be in Washington. Well, now we have bureaus all over the world. So it's a mixed picture, Ellen. What can I tell you? I don't mean to sound too rosy about it, because there are all kinds of dangers out there, and you've just mentioned several of them. But I still feel that smart people who care about the mission of journalism still have opportunities.
Okay, and one last question, and then we move to the topic of the book. When I introduced you a minute ago, I just mentioned that you won a Pulitzer Prize. And people recognize that as a prize that has some merit or importance, or a badge of honor, but most people really don't know what the hell is a Pulitzer Prize. Can you tell us what is that?
Yeah, the Pulitzer Prizes have been around since about 1916. They were funded by a guy named Joseph Pulitzer, who was a publisher of a lot of clickbait, incidentally, in his tabloid newspapers, but he also financed this sort of standard of journalism excellence. I'm very proud of my Pulitzer Prize. I won it for international reporting for covering the first Palestinian uprising in the late 1980s. It's interesting that right now we're seeing yet another uprising and so many things that make me almost want to pack my bag and go back there. Listen, it's a prize. It's it's a public relations gimmick to an extent. There were so many people who do so much good work. I love having won it. It was a great opportunity for me. I'm not giving it back, but I don't want to overemphasize it. There were a lot of great journalists out there working alongside me who didn't get it that year. And there were years when I didn't get it when I thought I should get it. But it's one way of looking for really good stories. And so if you go online and you go to the Pulitzer Prize website, you can see a number of really important stories about all kinds of issues. It's heavily American oriented, but there are prizes for other things, and for literature, I should mention. So it's just one standard of measuring excellence in the business.
Okay, great. Okay, so now we move on to your activities as a writer. Before this book, Shooting Midnight Cowboy, you wrote another book which became a bestseller. Could you tell us the name of that book and what was it about?
Well, the first of the three movies, it was the first of my three movie books. It was called The Searchers, The Making of an American Legend. And what I do in these books, and it started with The Searchers, was take a great American movie, in this case, the great John Ford Western that starred John Wayne, that came out in 1956. And I wrote about how the movie was made and how they put it together. But at the same time, I wrote about the era, the historical era that the movie reflects. And I ended up finding out right away that there was a true story behind the movie The Searchers, a true story of a little girl who was kidnapped by Comanche Native Americans in Texas in 1836, and how that story was told and retold over the generations, became a kind of frontier myth. And the American frontier myths, as you know, are very much part of our modern American myth about who we are as a people and how we do things. So I was writing about her, the original character. Her name was Cynthia Ann Parker, and people had studied her in Texas, but I'd never heard of her. I would imagine you didn't hear of her. I went back to that story and told and traced. And so that way the movie becomes just the latest version of the myth. And it just gave me a lot of insight into the power of the movie, the power of myth in American society. And it became a much longer and more complex story, but one that the characters were wonderful in. And eventually I got around to the movie itself again. It is a great American movie. It's about racism, but it's also has set in, because it's made in the 1950s, itself, it has a very paternalistic, racist attitude about Native Americans and about the settling of the West. I really love doing it, and I've stayed in that for now. This is my third book that uses movies as a looking glass into the past and into the American character.
And when you write these books, you are not writing about the your your understanding of the movie itself, but also the story behind the creation of the movie, which is what you wrote in this book, also the Shooting Midnight Cowboy. So can we go into this topic? What can you tell us about it?
Well, Midnight Cowboy, you know, I did these two other books, The Searchers, a great 1956 Western with John Wayne. And then I did High Noon, starring Gary Cooper. So I did these two books from these two movies from the 1950s. I wanted to go a little more modern to come closer to the present time. And I always felt, you know, I look for movies that have not been written about endlessly in books. And Midnight Cowboy, even though it won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 1970, and it's very high up on the American Film Institute list, it's been a little bit overlooked over the years. It was X-rated when it first came out and went on, as I say, to win prizes and to do very well. But I felt it was filmed in 1968, mostly in New York City. It came out in 1969. That's a fascinating time in our history. The Vietnam War is raging. Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King have been assassinated. Our country was undergoing a lot of political change and anxiety, a little bit like our time now, really. And also in culture as well, things were changing. Midnight Cowboy had adult themes. That's why it was rated X. It was a story of two social outcasts in New York, the kind of people who very seldom were depicted in American movies in that era. And American movies themselves were changing. You know, the old movie genres, the romantic comedies, the Westerns, the movie musicals were sort of fading away. And a new generation of consumers, including myself, what we would call the generation gap, the baby boom generation, was looking for interesting, different kinds of movies. Hollywood had just abolished its old system of censorship, which was called the production code. It had put in the rating system instead as a way to allow for a little more freedom and for adult themes. And a number of groundbreaking movies were made. And Midnight Cowboy was a barrier-breaking movie in many ways. I didn't even realize it, Elaine, when I started working on it, what an important pivotal moment that was, and why Midnight Cowboy, which could not have been made 5 years earlier under the old system. You couldn't even show a husband and wife in bed together in the production code. So suddenly we're in a new frontier here, not just in movies, but in literature and theater, all kinds of things. So it gave me lots of rich terrain to write about, and I really enjoyed working on this.
Wow, and this movie really takes advantage of that X rating that is new in the system, because as you mentioned, you couldn't show a man and a woman, a husband and wife in bed, and then all of a sudden, this movie showing heterosexual acts, homosexual acts, gang rape, prostitution, illegal drugs. How did the audience take, I mean, from one day where you cannot open show a toilet lid open in a movie, to now showing gang rape, prostitution, and illegal drugs? What was the reaction of the audience?
Well, this was beginning. I mean, Midnight Cowboy wasn't the very first movie to do some of this, but you're right. This was a big, big change. And the studios were very queasy about these kinds of things. And Midnight Cowboy wasn't made by a big studio. It actually was financed by United Artists for a very low budget. Nonetheless, the movie had a lot of things going for it as well. For one thing, it starred Dustin Hoffman, who had just become a major movie star thanks to The Graduate, another barrier-breaking movie from 1967. And Dustin Hoffman is not only now a star, but he's also a sort of counterculture hero because of The Graduate. And so he attracted a lot of people to come see Midnight Cowboy, including people like me. I was 19, and the movie came out in 1969, and I wanted to see Dustin Hoffman play this very different kind of role. Also, it's just such a high quality film in so many ways. John Schlesinger, the director, was a British director. Adam Hollander, the guy who filmed it, was a Polish cinematographer who'd come to America. The music is wonderful. Everybody's talking. The main song that's threaded through the movie is a fabulous song that sold a huge number of copies. The screenplay, there are a lot of things that made this movie compelling. The X rating was largely based on the fact that the head of United Artists was worried about homosexuality in the movie. He thought it was a really good movie, but this was back in the era of profound homophobia, even in liberal New York. And he was afraid that, young people like me, I don't know, straight young people like me would go see this film and be somehow converted to homosexuality. They thought of it almost like a disease, like COVID-19, something that was contagious. And we laugh at this now, but at the time, some very intelligent people, and this was the conventional wisdom of the age and of the psychoanalytical community. These were things I found really interesting to write about, because again, I'm not just trying to give you the movie, I'm trying to capture the era, what the sensibility was, what they were thinking. Movies can take you under the skin of a society and tell you lots of things that were going on at the time. And the X rating was to find out that this thing was rated X, not by the ratings board, but by the head of United Artists himself, was really interesting. And I think, again, reveals a lot about the times they made this movie. And so they were queasy about the movie, but they thought it was a good movie. And sure enough, it did very well, not only in reviews, but at the box office.
I also noticed that the director, John Schlesinger, and also the novel writer, James Herlihy. Wow, can you help me?
Herlihy, James Leo Herlihy. It's hard to pronounce.
Okay, so both of them were gay men. Do you think the fact that they were gay allows them, I don't know how far they can go on the line of sexuality or maybe because, well, I'm just making up things. I think maybe that's something that they think more often, or where is the line of homosexuality and heterosexuality, and how far can people go in a film?
Well, there's no nudity in Midnight Cowboy. There are a number of scenes, as you said, of gay sex and straight sex, the same in the novel. And the movie very much carries on a lot of the material in the novels, the scenes, and even some dialogue from at least the New York part of the novel. Look, these guys were very creative. This was Jim Herlihy's second novel. It's more open about sexuality than his previous work. John Schlesinger, as you point out, was a gay man. He captured, he depicts gay characters, and not always very favorably. He's trying to get at the human truth behind it. They weren't making a gay movie, as John kept saying. Jim Herlihy said, this is not a gay novel per se, it's about people and the situations they're in, and about loneliness, and about the need for people to come together to survive, and vulnerability. And so, did they have extra insight into those things because of their sexuality? I think they had a lot of insight for a lot of reasons, and that may have been one of them, yes. But I wouldn't overemphasize that particular thing with these guys. They were artists, and John Schlesinger knew what he wanted to do in New York. He knew what the core of this movie needed to be, the vulnerability of his two main characters, this young guy who comes from Texas up to New York thinking he's going to become a male hustler, Joe Buck, and he doesn't succeed. In fact, the New Yorkers strip him of his money very quickly. He's hustling no one very successfully. And then Dustin Hoffman plays Ratso Rizzo, this disabled, really dying, very ill street guy, con man in New York. And they're coming together in a partnership that is not sexual, but still becomes very intimate in a way. Two lonely people, two isolated people who band together to survive. That's the heart of the movie. That's the heart of what Schlesinger found so attractive about the novel. And that transcends sexuality, really, to get at the heart of the human condition. That's why the movie's worth watching in 2021.
Okay, so it's worth watching. So how accessible is it? Can people get it where? And the book as well?
The book you can get from many places, Amazon and
Right.
Barnes and Noble online, but also I would urge people to go to their local bookstore and get it, you know, and help promote, you know, and help save those bookstores in
Yeah.
this terrible time. And sometimes they'll have to order it for you. Some places have it, but or you can go to my website, which is www.glennfrankel. There's two N's in Glenn, FRANKEL.com. I've got about 9 places there where you can click on to get the book. But, and the movie you can get on Amazon Prime. You can get a number of places for like $3.99 or maybe even free. I don't think it's on Netflix right now, but Amazon Prime always has it. There's a wonderful Blu-ray version of it that Criterion put out a couple of years ago. I think the movie is one of the great films of that Hollywood era between the late 60s and the early 70s, of the new Hollywood era, when so many interesting movies like Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate and The Last Picture Show. Midnight Cowboy tends to get a little bit overlooked for a lot of reasons. We've talked about some of them. Nonetheless, it's one of the great movies of that era, and it sets the stage for a whole bunch of other great gritty New York movies that come after it, like, you know, Dog Day Afternoon and Serpico, and The Ultimate Taxi Driver, which is another great film from that era. So I think it's a movie that will, for a lot of people who don't know about it, will open their eyes to New York in an interesting way.
Well, you certainly sparked my curiosity. So, Glenn, the last question is, can you tell us one more time the title of the book, your book, and where can people follow you?
Well, it's called Shooting Midnight Cowboy, and the subtitle, which is very long, is Art, Sex, Loneliness, Liberation, and the Making of a Dark Classic. Really too long, but I try to capture so much in it. And they can follow me on my website where they can read reviews of the book, where they can order it, you know, click on to order it, where they can see where I'm talking next. You know, I put up some of these Zoom talks and schedule them. So those are all places where you can find me. You can just Google me and Midnight Cowboy and you'll get more than you ever wanted to run into. But I'm very proud of the book. It's gotten really good reviews, and it was the hardest book I've ever done, and I think the most rewarding.
And you really go into detail how this was made and on the different characters, the ups and downs of their life. Yeah, I really like it. Thank you so much, Glenn, for your time.
Well, Alan, thanks for having me on the show.